Hello and welcome to China Tonight. I'm Stan Grant. On the program, people refuse to pay their mortgages as the pressures facing China's economy rise. And who gets to jump over the Great Firewall, the grey area surrounding China's restrictions on the internet?
I remember during the Winter Olympics, this American Chinese athletes, Eileen Gu, said oh, what's the big deal, just get a VPN. But it's not that easy for a lot of people.
First tonight, sexual education delivered at school might still be a bit out of date and off point, but most kids in Australia will get the basics before they finish Year 10. Not so in China, where very few children receive meaningful advice, despite attempts in recent years to improve that, in part because the country's adults are still struggling to have conversations around consent and homosexuality. Annie Louey has this report.
As a teenager, sex ed came up in conversation with one of my cousins while I was in China. He told me you can't learn about sex in schools. So we went to a library and sneakily read some biology textbooks to find out how babies are made. Really? Is that how? Wow. Anyway, the books must have worked because my cousin has 2 kids now. It turns out my cousin's experience is fairly typical for many Chinese people. A recent survey from the China Family Planning Association found only half of university students had received sex education at school. And when they do, it's not always helpful.
School teachers, they would directly link early love to pregnancy without teaching them anything about contraception, about safe sex, about STD and so on.
Chong Liu is about to complete her PhD at Leeds University on sexuality education in China. So if students aren't being taught about sex in schools, where are they getting their info from?
So there are many different channels they use to get sexuality related knowledge. For example, novels. For example, even dictionaries. They even learn it from pornographies.
Porn in China is technically illegal. It seems like people find a way to get around it.
Yeah. So in China, many young people would call those porn stars as their sexuality education teacher because they will show them how sex works in a very, very straightforward way.
A lack of sexuality education has led some experts to say China has a national problem with sexual literacy. In a 2017 survey of sexual and reproductive health knowledge, high school students only answered every second question correctly. And abortion rates, particularly among young unmarried women, are as much as 2 to 3 times higher than in the US.
Sex has always been something that can only be talked about very privately. You don't talk about public in a classroom or in a public space.
Former UNESCO Program Officer Hongyan Li spent more than a decade lobbying to improve sexuality education in China. She says part of the problem is that talking about sex remains taboo. It's partly a hangover from history. Traditional belief systems like Confucianism forbid discussions around sex, and love and marriage were politicised during the Mao era. Even today, nudity is often removed from films, and movies involving homosexuality are censored and often banned. So, rolling out comprehensive sex education for kids in schools has sometimes been met with firm resistance.
The Cherished Life, a sexual education textbook for elementary students, covers a variety of sex and relationship issues.
This textbook caused a stir in 2017 after a parent posted on social media that even she would blush looking at it. It was deemed by parents to be too explicit, and some accused it of promoting homosexuality because it included a section on same-sex attraction. Many on Weibo agreed.
One user said the mating process is absolutely unacceptable.
Nonetheless, demand for sexuality education is on the rise. A string of high-profile domestic abuse cases prompted the government to make sexuality education compulsory in 2020 to help kids understand healthy attitudes around sex and relationships.
Having the policy in place is one thing, and then having the policy fully implemented is another. There's still a long way to go for the policy to be fully implemented.
The government is starting to recognise other practical benefits of sexuality education. The Healthy China initiatives launched in 2019 now incorporates more of UNESCO's comprehensive sexuality education guidelines. And from the awkward conversations come very real benefits.
So for each child and young person, through sexuality education, they are equipped with essential knowledge, skills, and attitudes that can empower them actually to live a life that is healthy, and also they understand their own rights and the rights of others.
So China is still a little prudish when it comes to sex, but things are changing.
The new generation now are more tolerant, are more open-minded, and they are more knowledgeable as well, yes. It's reflected in everywhere, every aspect of life, including in terms of their attitudes towards sex and sexuality.
Tiptoeing around the library to learn about sex might soon become a thing of the past.
Oi! Can't eat in here.
Sorry.
And Annie Louey joins me now. Annie, tell us, you've seen some first-hand proof, haven't you, of the impact of the lack of sex education in China?
Yes, the last time I went to China to visit my family, another one of my cousins had had a teenage pregnancy, and she was quite baffled around how it had happened with a schoolmate of hers, and my family ended up helping her raise the child. Abortions are available in China, however there is some stigma around young women, especially unmarried women, having abortions, and it's been denied to some of those people. So it seems that it's not discussed until it's too late, and it's in the past it's been on the husbands who are expected to teach their wives sex education, but then how are they supposed to have the knowledge by the time they're married at 20 or 22 years old, which is the legal age for men and women? Like, that is far too late. So it's good that it's changing. Even the wording, sexuality education, is meant to encompass all things to do with consent as well as just the physical act of sex.
There has still been some significant improvements, hasn't there, particularly when it comes to women's control of their bodies?
Yes. Also, I was surprised to learn that contraception is freely available without a prescription. Same with the morning after pill in China. And women are also starting to delay marriage because they're prioritising their career. I can also really relate to that. So the average age of women getting married in China is now 25 to 26 years old. And that's quite a few years on top of what it used to be. And women are also empowering themselves by purchasing sex toys. It's become a multi-billion-dollar industry. And over the last 5 years, it's increased by 80%. So these are brand new companies that are registering and making a lot of money out of this.
Sexual harassment, though, that still remains a sensitive topic.
Yes, it also triggered a Me Too response in 2018. So the cases that were popping up changed the legislation. They have now a definition of what it means to experience sexual harassment, but the downfall is they don't really have any consequences yet. So not many of the cases are being followed up and successfully, finding the perpetrators and having punishment for them. So it is a start to be able to recognise and define what it is, but we'll have to keep watching to see what happens next and whether the censoring of sexual harassment reports will stop.
Annie, thank you.
No worries. Thank you, Stan.
And now for what's making news on the platforms the people themselves use, Weibo and WeChat. And joining me is Yvonne Yong. Yvonne, there was a bit of chatter online this week about the property market.
Well, yes and no, Stan. Today it's more of a look at what people aren't talking about, because censors in China have gone into overdrive, trying to keep people from sharing their concerns online. Videos have been removed from social media, comments deleted, and the hashtag mortgage boycott was shut down. Why? Well, many residential development projects have been delayed or stalled, meaning mortgage holders are expected to pay for homes that aren't being built. Hence the tens of thousands of people threatening to boycott their payments.
It's a challenging life for those young people who buy a house during COVID with a mortgage.
No matter how you raise your voice, it's just a game for the ruling class.
They don't want you to think about it. See, they ban you because of your thoughts.
In response to the threats, China's banking watchdog has stepped in, saying banks will provide loans to delayed projects.
在地方党委政府有序组织下，在相关各方共同努力下，这些困难和问题都能得到合理的解决。
And the banking watchdog has also had to step in over an issue with people accessing their money.
Yes, 6 rural banks have had a freeze on cash withdrawals in place since April, which sparked rare protests on the streets of Henan province a few weeks ago. The regulator has promised to repay depositors, but it's just another sign of falling confidence in the financial sector. And there are signs the economy is slowing too. Officials reported lower than expected growth for the second quarter of the year. Now, this stalled growth, combined with high unemployment and COVID shutdowns, raises questions about whether the government will be able to meet its growth target of around 5.5% by the end of the year.
For more on this, I'm joined now by Lingling Wei, Chief China Correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Lingling was born in China and was back working there until she was expelled by the government, along with other American journalists, back in 2020. Lingling, it's good to have you with us. I want to get to your own personal circumstances in a minute, but there is so much happening economically, isn't there? And if you could just join the dots for us, and why are we seeing this downturn, and what impact does the property slump have on it?
Sure. China's economy really is in the worst shape it's been in for years, and it's largely due to the government's own doing. First, a campaign launched by President Xi Jinping last year to crack down on capitalist forces, namely private enterprise, which was very much driven by politics and ideology, had already significantly eroded business confidence and caused a plunge in private investment. And most recently, his stringent approach to COVID-19 outbreaks, the so-called zero COVID policy, has further hurt consumer spending and disrupted goods supply. So against that backdrop of very weak demand from both businesses and consumers alike, China's housing sector, traditionally a major driver for growth, is crumbling. We're seeing developers defaulting in droves, many of them unable to complete projects, and lately home buyers deciding not to make payments on the mortgages they had taken out to pay for unfinished apartments. So it's very notable that China's economy barely grew in the second quarter, which means the official growth target, 5.5%, is increasingly out of reach. It's very important because, some economists now expect China to miss the official target actually by a pretty big margin. And if that happens, that would certainly be a first in recent history.
And it will affect the country in so many ways, won't it? Of course, economically, but socially as well. So much wealth is tied up, as you've pointed out, in the housing market. People are concerned about their future. We're seeing rising unemployment, particularly amongst youth. How much concern is there now in the Chinese Communist Party about increased unrest and anger because of an economic downturn?
This kind of unrest and anger, Stan, couldn't have happened at the worst possible time for China's leadership, especially President Xi Jinping, because this is a year when President Xi is really trying to rally support for a third term in office, very unprecedented third term in recent history. Until recent months, he had seemed all but unassailable. For sure, President Xi remains extremely powerful, and he still remains on track to secure another 5 years in power. But in this gathering economic gloom, he has pulled back from some of his priorities, such as this economic overhaul campaign he launched last year, the crackdown on private enterprise and the effort to get the rich to share wealth. And we're seeing, some of, other political figures in China, notably President Xi's number 2, Premier Li Keqiang, has recently gained a greater role in managing the economy.
What are the options that are available? We've seen the Chinese Communist Party in a similar position in the past, of course, with the global financial crisis, the Asian financial crisis. There are other things available to them, and China was growing throughout that period. Now in a downturn, with a richer economy, what are the options available to them? It seems as if they're still banking on investment and infrastructure and to build their way out of this. But that's not going to be the answer, is it?
Exactly right. The old model of growth, this kind of debt-driven infrastructure-driven kind of growth model has reached its limits.
What are the answers? What should it be looking towards?
Well, the answer, the solution to China's economic problems, which are both structural and the ones caused by current policies, really lies with a restart of economic liberalization, and which means the use of market forces. Restart the process to invigorate market forces.
This is not a new thing, though, Lingling. This has been called for some time now. The question is, is the Chinese Communist Party prepared to get out of the way and relinquish some of that control?
Right now, we're not seeing any signs of that kind of reform momentum. For years, Chinese market reform, we have seen the government taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And for the past 5-10 years, it's mostly just the steps backward. And nowadays, because of, the Xi Jinping has made it very important that politics trumps everything else, we're really not seeing any kind of momentum of restarting this kind of economic liberalization process.
I want to ask about the impact it's going to have on the rest of the world. China is already the biggest engine of economic growth in the world. It is on track to become the biggest economy in the world. For Australia, it's Australia's biggest trading partner. What are the knock-on effects?
The knock-on effect would be huge, right? Because China is such a big importer of everything from coal, from iron ore to other commodities. So if China slows, and as China slows, the demand for those products, those commodities would decrease, and that would jack down global economy.
Lingling, can I ask you finally about your own personal situation? You're watching all this unfold far away from the country of your birth. Like other journalists, you were forced to leave and forced to leave family as well. How has that been for you? How difficult is it to report China now, not being in the country?
It certainly is very challenging, Stan. The biggest challenge is that, not being able to be there and talking to the people.
And being away from family as well.
Exactly, right. So that's the hardest part. But we all try our best. China is still such a big, important story. So still try our best to report on what's going on there as much as we can. What works for me is that, thank goodness, I spent the past 10 years in China and, had built up some really good contacts there. So trying to keep up with them as much as I can, keep up with my family, with my friends. But it's been hard. It's been very challenging, but we're trying our best.
Is it just not possible for you to go back? Can you see a time when you will be able to?
Well, if such opportunities arise, that will be on the next plane back to China.
Lingling Wei, thank you again for giving us your time.
Thank you very much, Stan.
China has heightened its warnings to the US over a proposed visit to Taiwan by House of Representatives Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and it's left Joe Biden in a tough spot.
Stan, Ms Pelosi was planning to go to Taiwan earlier this year, but she tested positive to COVID-19, scuttling the trip. Now it's back on the agenda. If it happens in August, she would be the highest-ranking US lawmaker to visit Taiwan in 25 years. But it's angered China's government because the trip could be seen as a violation of the One China principle.
I think that it's important for us to show support for Taiwan. I also think that none of us has ever said we're for independence when it comes to Taiwan. That's up to Taiwan to decide.
China's foreign ministry says there'll be consequences if the trip goes ahead.
如果美方一意孤行，中方必将采取坚决有力措施，坚定捍卫国家主权和领土完整。由此造成的一切后果，必须完全由美方负责。
The Financial Times writes that behind the scenes, China's rhetoric may even suggest a military response, although there's no detail on what that might involve. Some US officials are reportedly concerned Beijing could interfere with Taiwan's airspace during the visit.
And US President Joe Biden is stuck in the middle. He can't really tell her not to go, but doesn't want another thorn in China's side.
That's right. While the trip hasn't even been officially announced, President Biden did make these comments shortly before he tested positive to COVID late last week.
Mr. President, do you think it's a good idea for Speaker Pelosi to travel to Taiwan this summer?
Well, I think that the military thinks it's not a good idea right now, but I don't know what the status of it is.
Joe Biden says he hopes to speak with President Xi Jinping by phone before the end of the month. Ms. Pelosi is yet to comment on whether she'll consider abandoning the trip.
And President Xi has wished President Biden a speedy recovery from COVID. While we know Joe Biden is fully vaccinated, Xi Jinping's vaccination status was revealed for the first time this weekend.
The news was released as part of a campaign to increase vaccination rates in China. The deputy head of the National Health Commission, Zheng Yixin, announced that top party leaders, including Xi Jinping, had been vaccinated using domestically produced vaccines, adding that they were safe and effective. While roughly 90% of China's population have received 2 doses, only 61% of those over 80 are fully vaccinated. Officials have warned that lower vaccination rates among the elderly could put a squeeze on health resources if the virus spreads widely. Well, China is still pursuing what it calls a dynamic zero COVID policy, with strict containment and testing measures still in place across the country. In Beijing and some other major cities, residents must queue for PCR tests every 3 days. The country has been recording hundreds of new cases each day for the past week.
Thanks, Yvonne.
Thanks, Dan.
A major concern among the unvaccinated in China is a lack of transparency from government and vaccine makers about their safety and effectiveness. While we in Australia might turn to trusted sources online to find more information, for those in China that can be more difficult. China Tonight reporter Yehan has this story.
It's well known the Chinese internet is closed off to the outside world. In fact, the Great Firewall is so effective that people in China often sarcastically refer to their web as the Chinese local area network. Because of this, many rely on virtual private networks, or VPNs, to jump over the wall and access apps and websites blocked by the Chinese government.
When you use a VPN, you're using an envelope, and on that envelope, the address is coded. So whoever intercepts that message will not only not have access to the content of that message, but will also not be able to know where that message is intended to go. That's the purpose of a VPN.
Benjamin Ismail is a member of GreatFire.org, an anonymous organization that monitors China's internet censorship. He says VPNs are getting increasingly harder to use in China.
For many years, the authorities have tried to block or render inefficient the VPNs.
Tech reporter Viola Zhou says the situation is complicated.
The legal status of VPNs, the regulations and laws currently in effect, they are very, very vague.
The laws, the way it is phrased, and the enforcement of the law, which is sometimes seems random and is not enforced in a similar way systematically, then that creates a big confusion.
The punishment targeting individual users have been quite rare compared to the sheer number of people using VPNs. But it has also created a sense of fear that people know, if I do this, I'm doing something illegally. And then some people may just don't want to take the risk.
The authorities purposely maintain a gray area. They maintain confusion.
But the government's goal is not as simple as a complete shutdown. It also understands that access to the other side of the Great Firewall is necessary for many to do their work in the modern world.
For example, Google is blocked in China, but a lot of academics, scientists, researchers, they need to access Google Scholar. It's just a very good service. They want to use Gmail. They want to use Google Drive to connect with people abroad.
Many businesses like banks and other financial institutions or other legitimate businesses need to use VPN on a daily basis. They cannot operate without. The authorities are aware of that, and their crackdown on VPNs was never aimed at those companies.
And it's about more than just business.
If you crack down on this too hard, you may turn some people political. Like a lot of people, like young people, they just want to get out of the war so they can read about BTS.
Hello, we are BTS.
If you ban it too strictly, you may kind of anger those people and then get a backlash from them.
A 2017 cybersecurity law tried to assert some control over the situation, banning all foreign VPN services, but giving some businesses and institutions access to state-approved VPNs.
So that means that even when you use a VPN that allows you to bypass the Great Firewall, your activities are monitored and the government can still punish you for content or messages that you could post on foreign platforms.
And these state-sanctioned VPNs aren't available to just anyone.
I remember like during the Winter Olympics, this American Chinese athlete Eileen Gu said like, oh, what's the big deal, just get a VPN. But it's not that easy for a lot of people. There's a real tech inequality going on here. Like people from more privileged backgrounds, they can go to better universities, they can go abroad themselves, and then they also have the know-how getting VPNs. But people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, it will be more difficult for them.
It's also worth noting that demand for wider internet access is not as high as might be expected.
Before talking about how to get a VPN, you have to be wanting to get a VPN. And a lot of young people with this rise of nationalism, they just don't feel they need a VPN.
In a 2018 study, researchers recruited 1,800 university students and divided them into two groups. One was provided with tools to bypass internet censorship for free for 10 months, and the other was subject to the status quo censorship of China. They found that without explicit encouragement, students in the treatment group showed little interest in accessing the wider internet.
That study revealed that after some time, and it's especially true for the younger generation, you can open the door of the cage and the bird will not even try to fly and to escape. That is one of the long-term effects of censorship in China.
And that's all from us tonight. We'll be back in 2 weeks with more stories from China. Next week, I'll be coming to you from the Gama Festival in the Northern Territory for a special Q&A program. I hope you can join me then. Good night.